You read about the case of Cheryl Hopwood. She applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School. Cheryl Hopwood had worked her way through high school. She didn't come from an affluent family. She put herself through community college and California State University at Sacramento. She achieved a 3.8 grade point average there. Later moved to Texas, became a resident, took the law school admissions test, did pretty well on that, and she applied to the University of Texas Law School. She was turned down. She was turned down at a time when the University of Texas was using an affirmative action admissions policy, a policy that took into account race and ethnic background. The University of Texas said 40% of the population of Texas is made up of African Americans and Mexican Americans. It's important that we, as a law school, have a diverse student body. And so we are going to take into account not only grades and test scores, but also the demographic makeup of our class, including its race and ethnic profile. The result of that policy is that some applicants to the University of Texas Law School with a lower academic index, which includes grades and test scores, than hers, were admitted, and she was turned down. She said, she argued, I'm just being turned down because I'm white. If I were a member of a minority group with my grades and test scores, I would have been admitted.
You're basing something on that's an arbitrary factor. You know, Cheryl couldn't control the fact that she was white or not in a minority. And therefore, you know, it's not as if it was like a test score that she worked hard to try and show that she could, you know, put that out there, you know, that she had no control over her race.
Good. And what's your name?
Bree.
Okay, Bree, stay right there. Now let's find someone who has an answer for Bree. Yes.
There are discrepancies in the educational system, and majority of the time, I know this in New York City, the schools that minorities go to are not as well funded, are not as well supplied as white schools. And so there is going to be a discrepancy naturally between minorities and between whites.
Tell me your name.
Anisha.
Anisha. Anisha, you're pointing out that minority kids may have gone, in some cases, to schools that didn't give them the same educational opportunity as kids from affluent families.
Yes.
And so the test scores they got may actually not represent their true potential in defense of affirmative action, Anisha's argument, correcting for the effects of unequal preparation, educational disadvantage. Bree.
If it's that one thing that puts, you know, someone over the edge, then I guess that would be, you know, justifiable. If everything else about the individual first, though, everything they consider about that person's, you know, talents and where they come from and who they are without these arbitrary factors is the same.
Without these arbitrary factors, you call it. But before you were suggesting, Bree, that race and ethnicity are arbitrary factors outside the control of the applicants.
True, I would agree with that.
And your general principle is that admissions shouldn't reward arbitrary factors over which people have no control.
Right.
All right. What do you say?
Well, first of all, I'm for affirmative action temporarily, but for two reasons. First of all, you have to look at the university's purpose. It is to educate their students. And I feel that different races, people coming from different races have different backgrounds and they contribute differently to the education. And second of all, when you say they have equal backgrounds, that's not true when you look at the broader picture and you look at slavery. And this is kind of a reparation. I think affirmative action is a temporary solution to alleviate history and the wrongs done to African Americans in particular.
And what's your name?
David.
David. You say that affirmative action is justified, at least for now, as a way of compensating for past injustice, the legacy of slavery and segregation.
Right.
I think that what happened in the past has no bearing on what happens today, and I think that discriminating based on race should always be wrong.
Because of past injustices, today we have a higher proportion of African Americans who are in poverty, who face less opportunities than white people. And so because of slavery 200 years ago, and because of Jim Crow and because of segregation, today we have injustice based on race.
Kate?
I think that there are differences, obviously, but the way to fix those differences is not by some artificial fixing of the result. You need to fix the problem. So we need to address differences in education and differences in upbringing with programs like Head Start and giving more funding to lower income schools rather than trying to just fix the result so it makes it look like it's equal when really it isn't.
For these contributions, we're going to come back to you. If you've listened carefully, I think you will have noticed 3 different arguments. One argument has to do with correcting for the effects of educational disadvantage. That was Anisha's argument. This is what we might call the corrective argument. Correcting for differences in educational background, the kind of school people went to, the opportunities they had, and so on. That's one argument. What's worth noticing, though, is that that argument is consistent in principle with the idea that only academic promise and scholarly potential should count in admissions. We just need to go beyond test scores and grades alone to get a true estimate of academic promise and scholarly ability. Then we heard a second argument that said affirmative action is justified even where there may not be the need to correct for educational disadvantage in a particular applicant's case. It's justified as a way of compensating for past wrongs, for historic injustices. So that's a compensatory argument, compensating for past wrongs. Then we heard a different, that argued in the name of diversity. Now, the diversity argument is different from the compensatory argument because it makes a certain appeal to the social purpose or the social mission of the college or university. There are really 2 aspects to the diversity argument. One says it's important to have a diverse student body for the sake of the educational experience for everyone. Hannah made that point. And the other talks about the wider society. This was the argument made by the University of Texas in the Hopwood case. We need to train lawyers and judges and leaders, public officials, who will contribute to the strength, the civic strength of the state of Texas and the country as a whole. Because it says, for reasons Hannah and others pointed out, that the common good is served, is advanced, if there is a racially and ethnically diverse student body. Everyone benefits. And this indeed was the argument that Harvard made when it filed a friend of the court brief to the Supreme Court in the 1978 case, affirmative action case, the Bakke case. And the Harvard brief, the Harvard rationale, was cited by Justice Powell, who was the swing vote in the case, upholding affirmative action. He cited that as providing the rationale that he thought was constitutionally acceptable. Harvard's argument in its brief was this: we care about diversity. Scholarly excellence alone has never been the criterion of admission, the sole criterion of admission to Harvard College. 15 years ago, diversity meant students from California and New York and Massachusetts, city dwellers and farm boys, violinists, painters and football players, biologists, historians, and classicists. The only difference now, Harvard argued, is that we're adding racial and ethnic status to this long list of diversity considerations. When reviewing the large number of candidates able to do well in our classes, Harvard wrote, race may count as a plus, just as coming from Iowa may count. A farm boy from Idaho can bring something to Harvard College that a Bostonian cannot offer. Similarly, a black student can usually bring something a white student cannot offer. The quality of the educational experience of all students depends in part on these differences in the background and outlook that students bring with them. That was Harvard's argument. Now, what about the diversity argument? Is it persuasive? Unless you're a utilitarian, you believe that individual rights can't be violated. Now, one obvious reason to worry is Aristotle's defense of slavery. He defends slavery, which existed as an institution in the Athens of his day. Well, what is his defense of slavery? Two conditions have to be met for slavery to be just. First, it has to be necessary. And Aristotle says, at least in our society, slavery is necessary. Why is it necessary? If there are to be citizens who are freed from manual and menial and household chores, to go to the assembly, to deliberate about politics, there have to be some who look after those menial tasks, the mere necessities of life. He says, unless you could invent in some science fiction a technological fix, then there are going to be those who have to do the hard and difficult and menial labor if there are to be citizens deliberating about the good and realizing their nature. So slavery is necessary for the life of the polis, for there to be open to citizens. And what those who disagree point out is that there are a lot of people in Athens who are slaves, not because they were born to be slaves or fit to be slaves, but because they were captured, they were losers in a war. And so Aristotle admits that as practiced in ancient Athens, slavery didn't necessarily line up with who actually is fit or born to be a slave. Yes?
My objection to Aristotle is that he wants to match a person to a role. And, you know, if you walk like a pirate and you talk like a pirate, you know, you should be a pirate. And that is what is right. And so what's strange and seemed paradoxical to me about Aristotle's viewpoint is that if you walk like a pirate and you talk like a pirate, you shouldn't be an investment banker, because that's not what you're inherently supposed to do. If you have a peg leg and an eye patch and a disgruntled disposition, you know, you should be on a pirate ship on the high seas. So he doesn't,
Some would say the distinction between the two vocations is not as clear as you suggest. All right, but that's good. I take the point. Yes. Go ahead.
It just seems to ignore individual rights. So I might be the perfect janitor in the whole world, and I can do that job the most efficiently out of anybody that exists right now, but I might not want to do that. I might want to do any other number of pursuits, and it seems to say that that isn't really a good option for me.
All right, and what's your name?
Mary Kate?
Good. Mary Kate said, what if a person is very well suited to having a certain role, like the role of being a janitor, but wants something else, wants to reach higher, wants to choose another way of life? So that goes back to this question about freedom. If we take our bearing as persons from roles that are said to fit our nature, shouldn't it at least be up to us to decide what those roles are? In fact, shouldn't it be up to us to define what roles are suitable to us? And that's going to take us back to the confrontation between Aristotle on the one hand and Kant and Rawls on the other. What's at stake in the debate about teleology, say Rawlsian and Kantian liberals, is this. If you tie justice to a particular conception of the good, if you see justice as a matter of fit between a person and his or her roles, you don't leave room for freedom. And to be free is to be independent of any particular roles or traditions or conventions that may be handed down by my parents or my society. Alistair MacIntyre gives an account, what he calls a narrative conception of the self. It's a different account of the self. Human beings are essentially storytelling creatures, McIntyre argues. That means I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part? That's what he means by the narrative conception of the self. What does this have to do with the idea of community and belonging? McIntyre says this: once you accept this narrative aspect of moral reflection, you will notice that we can never seek for the good or exercise the virtues only as individuals. We all approach our circumstance as bearers of particular social identities. I am someone's son or daughter, a citizen of this or that city. I belong to this clan, that tribe, this nation. Hence, McIntyre argues, what is good for me has to be the good for someone who inhabits these roles. I inherit from the past of my family, my city, my tribe, my nation, a variety of debts, inheritances, expectations, and obligations. These constitute the given of my life, my moral starting point. This is, in part, what gives my life its moral particularity. That's the narrative conception of the self. And it's a conception that sees the self as claimed or encumbered, at least to some extent, by the history, the tradition, the communities of which it's a part. We can't make sense of our lives, not only as a psychological matter, but also as a moral matter in thinking what we ought to do without attending to these features about us. Now, McIntyre recognizes that this narrative account, this picture of the encumbered self, puts his account at odds with contemporary liberalism and individualism, expressed by those contemporary Americans who deny any responsibility for the effects of slavery upon black Americans, saying, I never owned any slaves. Or the young German who believes that having been born after 1945 means that what Nazis did to Jews has no moral relevance to his relationship to his Jewish contemporaries. McIntyre says all of these attitudes of historical amnesia, that the self can't be detached, shouldn't be detached from its particular ties of membership, history.
Simply by virtue of being in being influenced by them. I'm a German citizen, and if I had been born 80 years earlier, then I would have been a citizen of Nazi Germany. And for some reason, I just don't think that I would have to feel obligated towards Germany because I had benefited from actions of Nazis.
I mean, I guess my response to that would be you have hundreds of thousands of protesters in the United States right now who hold up signs that say peace is patriotic. And I'm sure there are people in this room who don't agree with that. I personally do. And I would say that they're strongly objecting to basically everything the Bush administration is doing right now, but they still consider themselves loving their country because they're furthering the cause of what they see as best for the country. And I tend to agree with that as a patriotic movement.
Well, but how's that then? How do you still favor your country? How's that still patriotic? I mean, isn't that more a sentimental attachment? Where's the obligation there?
Here's an even more fateful example from a figure in American history, Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee, on the eve of the Civil War, was an officer of the Union Army. He opposed secession, in fact, regarded it as treason. When war loomed, Lincoln offered Lee to be the commanding general of the Union Army. And Lee refused, and he described in a letter to his sons why he refused. With all my devotion to the Union, he wrote, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. by which he meant Virginia. The Union is dissolved, I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people, save in her defense, I will draw my sword no more. Now here's a real test, Dan, for your principle of loyalty. Because here is the cause of the war against, not only to save the Union, but against slavery. And Lee is going to fight for Virginia, even though he doesn't share the desire of the southern states to secede. Now, the communitarian would say there is something admirable in that. Whether or not the decision was ultimately right, there's something admirable. And the communitarian would say, we can't even make sense. Rena, we can't make sense of Lee's dilemma as a moral dilemma unless we acknowledge that the claim of loyalty arising from his sense of narrative of who he is a moral, not just sentimental, emotional tug. Well, let's take a look at a short clip from the documentary Eyes on the Prize. It goes back in the 1950s in the South. Here are some situated American Southerners who believe in the tradition, in the shared understandings of segregation. Listen to the arguments they make about loyalty and tradition, and see if they don't make you uneasy about tying arguments about justice to the shared understandings or traditions that prevail in any given society at the moment. Let's run the clip.
This land is composed of two different cultures, a white culture and a colored culture, and I've lived close to them all my life. But I'm told now that we've mistreated them and that we must change, and these changes are coming faster than I expected, and I'm required to make decisions on a basis of a new way of thinking, and it's difficult. It's difficult for me, it's difficult for all Southerners.
Well, there you have it. Narrative selves, situated selves, invoking tradition. Doesn't that show us that justice can't be tied to the shared understandings of goods that prevail in any given community at any given time? Or is there a way of rescuing that claim from this example? Now, same-sex marriage draws on, implicates deeply contested and controversial ideas, morally and religiously. And so there's a powerful incentive to embrace a conception of justice or of rights that doesn't require the society as a whole to pass judgment one way or another on those hotly contested moral and religious questions about the moral permissibility of homosexuality, about the proper ends of marriage as a social institution. So clearly, if there's an incentive to resolve this question, to define people's rights in a way that doesn't require the society as a whole to sort out those moral and religious disputes, that would be very attractive. So what I would like to do now is to see, using the same-sex marriage case, whether it's possible to detach one's views about the moral permissibility of homosexuality and about the purpose, the end of marriage, to detach those questions from the question of whether the state should recognize same-sex marriage or not. So let's begin. I would like to begin by hearing the arguments of those who believe that there should be no same-sex marriage, but that the state should only recognize marriage between a man and a woman. Do I have volunteers? I had two. There were two people I asked, people who had voiced their views already on the Justice blog, Mark Luff and Ryan McCaffrey. Where are you? Okay, Mark, and where's Ryan? All right, let's go first to Mark.
I have sort of a teleological understanding of the purpose of sex and the purpose of marriage. And I think that for people like myself who are a Christian and also a Catholic, the purpose of sex is, one, for its procreative uses, and two, for a unifying purpose between a man and a woman within the institution of marriage.
You have a certain conception of the purpose, or the telos, of human sexuality, which is bound up with procreation.
Right.
As well as union.
Yeah.
And the essence of marriage, the purpose of marriage as a social institution, is to give expression to that telos and to honor that purpose, namely the procreative purpose of marriage. Is that a fair summary of your view?
Yeah.
Where's Ryan? Go ahead. Do you agree more or less with Mark's reasons?
Yes, I agree. I think that the ideal of marriage involves procreation, and it's fine that homosexuals would go off and cohabitate with each other, but the government doesn't have a responsibility to encourage that.
All right, so the government should not encourage homosexual behavior by conferring the recognition of marriage.
Yeah, it would be wrong to outlaw it, but encouraging it is not necessary.
Who has a reply? Hannah?
I'd just like to ask a question to Mark. Let's say you got married to a woman, you did not have sex with her before marriage, and then when you became married, it became evident that you were an infertile couple. Do you think that it should be illegal for you to engage in sex if children will not result from that act?
Yeah, I think that it is moral, and that's why I gave the twofold purpose. So like a woman, say, I think older couples can get married, a woman who's beyond, who's already had menopause, and who can't have a child, because I think that sex has it has purposes beyond procreation.
I hate to be uncouth, but have you ever engaged in masturbation?
Yeah. You don't have to answer that. You can.
Well, yeah, I think all right.
Just a minute. No. Why? Make your.
I'd like to respond to that.
No, I think. Wait. Look, we've done pretty well over a whole semester, and we're doing pretty well now, dealing with questions that most people think can't even be discussed in a university setting. And Hannah, you have a powerful point. Make that point as a general argument rather than as an interrogative.
Okay.
But make the point. What's the principle that you're appealing? What's the argument you have in mind?
All right. Well, biblically...
Put it in the third person.
Yeah. Okay.
Rather than in the second
sure.
person. Make the argument. Go ahead.
Okay. Biblically, masturbation or onanism is not permissible because it's spilling your seed on the earth when it's not going to result in the birth of a child. But what I'm saying is, you're saying that sex, there's something wrong with sex if it doesn't produce children or reinforce the marriage bond.
Right.
But then how can you say that there's something wrong, that masturbation is permissible if masturbation obviously is not going to create a child?
Yeah, I think marriage is society's way to create this separate institution where they say, this is what we hold as a virtue. Yes, every day we fall short, and people fall short in so many different other ways. But I think that if you personally fall short in some moral sphere, as we all do, that doesn't take the right of you to argue.